There's a moment in Princess Mononoke that tells you almost everything about how Studio Ghibli understands conflict. A creature comes crashing through the forest. It's huge, violent, falling apart as it moves, like something underneath its skin is forcing its way out. Arrows hit it, nothing happens, and almost automatically, your mind does what stories trained it to do. You label it. You think, okay, that's the monster. And then it dies. And what's left behind is something stranger and sadder. It isn't a monster at all. It's a god. A god that was poisoned, one that suffered, and one that became terrifying because something terrible had already been done to it. And in that moment, the whole emotional logic shifts. Because if that wasn't the villain, then what is? That question sits at the center of so many Ghibli films. Not just who caused the damage, not just who fights whom, but what kind of world creates this in the first place. That's what makes Ghibli conflict feel so different. Most stories build conflict like a line. There's peace, disruption, then a struggle, and finally some kind of resolution. Ghibli tends to arrive later than that. By the time we enter these worlds, the damage is already in motion. The forest is already wounded. The war has already started. The system has already learned how to turn people into parts. The child is already carrying way too much. That's why these stories feel heavy in such a particular way. They aren't obsessed with the first spark. They're interested in what happens after a pattern has already settled in, after fear has repeated itself enough times to start feeling normal, after a way of living becomes so familiar that people stop asking whether it should have existed at all. And honestly, that feels a lot closer to real life. Things rarely collapse in one dramatic instant. They drift. A compromise gets made. A line gets crossed. Someone decides this is acceptable for now. Another person adapts. A system hardens a little more. And one day you look around and realize the world has been bending in a bad direction for a long time. That's one of the clearest patterns in Ghibli. Conflict usually isn't written as one event. It behaves more like a loop. And you can see it in Princess Mononoke more clearly than almost anywhere else. Irontown needs protection, so it builds weapons. The forest responds to those weapons. That danger then justifies more force. Every side sees itself as reacting. Every side can explain why its next move makes sense. And because each step feels reasonable from the inside, the whole pattern keeps feeding itself. That's what makes Ghibli conflict feel mature. Nobody wakes up and says, I want to ruin the world today. People tell themselves they're surviving. They're protecting their own. They're doing what the moment requires. They're solving a problem that someone else created. And meanwhile, the cycle keeps growing teeth. Even a character like No-Face works that way. He doesn't enter Spirited Away as some grand evil presence with a master plan. He absorbs the atmosphere around him. The hunger of the bathhouse, the greed, the way attention gathers around whatever can be consumed. And gradually he swells into something grotesque. That's such a Ghibli move. The danger grows out of the environment. Which means conflict in these films is never just about the individual. It's about what a world rewards, what it normalizes, and what it teaches people to become. That's why I think Ghibli returns to a few core pressures over and over again. One of them is war pressing down on innocence. That's the one that was responded to the strongest in my recent poll. And I think it's because Ghibli understands that violence does its deepest damage long before it reaches the battlefield. It gets into the home, into the body, into the routines that were supposed to feel ordinary. It turns daily life fragile. That's why Grave of the Fireflies hurts the way it does. The film doesn't ask you to think about strategy. It doesn't care about heroics. It cares about hunger, shame, exhaustion, and the unbearable fact that children end up paying for the delusions of adults. That's also why the war in Howl's Moving Castle feels so haunting. It moves through the film like a giant piece of machinery that nobody can fully justify, and nobody powerful seems willing to stop. Cities burn, lives get pulled into it, and the emotional center of the story stays much closer to care, fear, aging, tenderness, and the fragile process of becoming yourself. Ghibli loves that contrast. History at full scale on one side, one vulnerable life on the other. And somehow that one life still matters enough to carry the truth of the whole story. And another pressure running through Ghibli is the relationship between people and the living world around them. This is where Miyazaki, in particular, becomes impossible to separate from the work. People often reduce this part of Ghibli to environmental themes. And that's true, but it's also smaller than what the films are actually doing. These movies are rarely saying in some simplistic way that humans are evil and nature is pure. They're more interested in the collision. People want safety, they want work, food, progress, or to build something that lasts. And those desires are real. But they have weight. They tear into forests, poison water, reshape whole landscapes, and turn living things into obstacles. That's why Princess Mononoke feels so rich. Lady Eboshi is doing real harm, but she's also creating a place for people who were discarded by the rest of society. San is protecting a world that is being destroyed in front of her eyes. Ashitaka moves between them, carrying this impossible task of seeing clearly while everyone around him is pulled by grief, rage, pride, duty, and survival. That's conflict at Ghibli's best. It reaches past who's right and asks what kind of future gets built when every side is already wounded. And you feel the same pattern in Nausicaä too. The poisoned world is terrifying. But the deeper revelation is that the world has been responding to human damage in ways people didn't fully understand. The problem was never the jungle. The problem was the broken relationship between human ambition and everything it touched. And then Spirited Away takes that idea and makes it spiritual. Pollution becomes a stain on memory. Consumption turns people almost unrecognizable. A river spirit carries the physical evidence of what was thrown into it, but also something harder to describe. The feeling of a world that has been used without being respected. That's another thing Ghibli understands better than most stories. Damage is never only physical. A place can be wounded. A culture can be wounded. A person can be wounded so deeply that they begin to live like woundedness is their natural state. And then there's one more kind of conflict Ghibli keeps returning to. Maybe quieter at first, but just as important. The struggle between the human soul and systems that want to reduce it. That pressure is everywhere in these films. Sometimes it looks like war. Sometimes labor, or bureaucracy, magic, a curse, and sometimes a role that starts closing around a person until it becomes hard to tell where the role ends and the self begins. You can feel that all over Spirited Away. Chihiro enters a world where names can be taken, labor becomes identity, and survival depends on learning the rules of a structure that was there long before she arrived. And you can feel it in Castle in the Sky, where technology and power begin drifting toward domination, almost as if it was a habit. Ghibli keeps returning to the same question. How much of yourself can you keep once the world starts naming your purpose for you? That's such a human fear. Not death exactly. Reduction. Becoming a tool, a symbol, a worker, a soldier, a resource, a thing that can be used. And that's why the emotional turning points in Ghibli often come through recognition. Nausicaä doesn't win by overpowering the jungle. She learns how to see it. Chihiro doesn't solve No-Face by crushing him. She responds to him as something more than a threat. Again and again, the movement toward healing begins when someone sees clearly enough to interrupt the pattern. And that matters, because violence gets easier when people stop feeling real. Once someone becomes a label, a class, an enemy, a burden, a target, a problem to manage, cruelty becomes much easier to justify. The moral imagination shrinks. The person disappears behind the category. Recognition does the opposite. It restores specificity. It returns weight to a life, to a place, to a creature, to a suffering that had been flattened into abstraction. That doesn't fix everything. Ghibli is far too honest for that. But it does change the emotional direction. It slows the machinery down. It creates the possibility of mercy. It reminds the story and us what is actually at stake. And I think that's where Miyazaki and Takahata both feel especially important. These films carry a deep memory of post-war Japan, rapid industrial expansion, environmental damage, and the moral distortion that comes with modern power moving way too fast. Miyazaki grew up in a country rebuilding itself through industry and momentum, and that history matters. So does the shadow of environmental catastrophe, including events like Minamata disease, where industrial pollution poisoned communities through the water. That background makes films like Nausicaä, Mononoke, and even Howl feel less like fantasy worlds and more like moral thought carried through images. And Takahata brings a different kind of weight. With him, war and social failure often feel brutally intimate. He doesn't need a grand theory. He shows you what remains after systems fail at the level of the family, the child, the body, the meal that never comes. That's why Studio Ghibli's conflict rarely feels abstract. It feels lived in. A strange creature crosses the screen, but the emotion underneath it is recognizable. A magical setting opens up, but the wound inside it belongs to history. A fantasy crisis unfolds, but it carries the shape of something we know from ordinary life. That's a big part of why these films still hit now. Because we still live in loops. We still build systems that reward hardness, ones that turn difference into danger, or sort people into categories that make empathy thinner. And we still let convenience outrank care, or treat domination like maturity and tenderness like weakness. And once that logic settles in, conflict spreads quickly. It moves from politics into culture, from culture into language, from language into the soul. People begin treating whole groups as disposable. The earth becomes a storehouse. Violence becomes administration. Cruelty gets explained as necessity. And Ghibli, quietly but persistently, pushes against all of that. It keeps asking whether we remember what's alive around us. Not just the forests, or the children, or the obvious victims. Everything. The person on the other side of your certainty. The place beneath your convenience. The thing you are about to treat as background. That's why I don't think Ghibli writes conflict as hero versus villain, at least not in the deepest sense. It writes conflict as a condition of separation, a break in relationship. Human beings estranged from nature, power estranged from conscience, people estranged from one another, even the self, at times, estranged from itself. And once you see that, a lot of these films start to rhyme with each other. The details change, the worlds change, the aesthetics change, but underneath them is the same ache. How do you live in a broken world without becoming part of what broke it? That's such a hard question, harder than most stories even want to ask, because there isn't a clean answer. And Ghibli knows that. Its endings almost never feel interested in neat repair. The world doesn't snap back into place. Some things heal, other things remain altered. Sometimes the violence stops and the loss stays. Sometimes what grows afterward is beautiful, but different. Sometimes all anyone really earns is a chance to begin again with a little more honesty. That's where the idea of Mononoke fits so beautifully. That awareness that things are always shifting, that nothing stays held in perfect resolution. That beauty and sadness often arrive together because everything is passing, changing, slipping out of the form it used to have. Ghibli trusts that feeling. It doesn't force closure where closure hasn't been earned. It lets the story breathe inside uncertainty. And maybe that's why these movies linger, because they understand that the deepest conflicts in life are rarely solved in the satisfying story sense. They're carried, interrupted, softened, survived, sometimes understood too late. So when I think about how Studio Ghibli writes conflict, I keep coming back to that first image. A creature storms toward us, full of rage, and we search for a simple explanation. Who did this? Who deserves blame, and where do I place that fear? And Ghibli gently pulls that certainty apart. It shows us a world where suffering travels, where violence changes shape, where systems teach people how to stop seeing clearly, where fear can become policy, progress can become desecration, and survival itself can harden into something cruel. But it also shows something else. A person pausing long enough to understand, a hand reaching toward what still hurts, someone refusing to let the world reduce a life into a function, someone protecting what remains tender. That's the part Ghibli never lets go of. Even in its darkest moments, it holds on to the possibility that recognition can interrupt the pattern. Maybe not forever, maybe not perfectly, but enough to matter. And maybe that's the real reason Ghibli conflict stays with people. Because it doesn't just ask how the world gets broken. It asks whether we can still notice the break while there's still something left to save.